Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of my series going over the movies and shows I watch in a given month. Today, I'm here to talk about all of the movies and shows I watched in August. As always, all of the media I will be talking about has been ranked from worst to best, and you can otherwise track everything I watch on my Letterboxd profile. In hindsight, I feel like I watched a lot less than I actually did, and that could be because I tried to use up more of my time doing chores, working on projects, and playing some new games rather than devote every waking moment to being a couch potato watching stuff. But there was a fair amount that I ultimately did end up watching, the likes of which I will start off by mentioning a cult classic Disney comedy from the 90s, Heavyweights. I will only bring up this movie in passing for two reasons. The first being that this is one of those movies I consider impossible for me to review without any strand of bias, so I didn't even score it for the purposes of this video. The second reason is this special movie gets talked about so infrequently that I want to make a video about it. Who knows when that project will come to fruition, but I will make it happen. As for those movies and shows which did get ranked in this video though, let's begin by talking about Stripes. I was already disappointed that I missed the opportunity of having my first viewing of Stripes in a theater for its 40th anniversary, but that chance was squandered by my dumb schedule, so I watched it at home. Imagine my even greater disappointment then, when I discovered that it did not work for yours truly. Very specific things it does with its script have since been done better by other movies. Specifically, it's totally okay to have a slacker as the main protagonist, just make their escapades really funny, or give them consequences to work through, neither of which really apply here. It also has a very weird structure in which, as others have pointed out in their reviews on Letterboxd, each act is just kind of its own movie that barely fits in with the others. The final act stands out in particular with its action-centric finale falling apart due to its tonal difference from what came before, along with the action itself being laughably staged and corny. Additionally, people talk about films and games pandering to the male fantasy, but this one absolutely does with its unnecessary amounts of female nudity, poorly written female characters, and the main cast of characters getting away with too much tomfoolery. I'd have less of an issue with those things if it was problematic in the same way that Blazing Saddles was, for that movie is so dang fun that the dated elements don't stick out as much. But Stripes doesn't have that luxury, for it's both dated and underwhelming. What a shame. Up next we have Star Trek the Motion Picture. I've never had anything against Star Trek, for my household growing up was both a Star Wars and Star Trek family, but I easily gravitated more towards Star Wars personally, so I've only seen a few of the movies and some scattered episodes from the different series. Because of that, I wanted to fill that hole in my nerdy life and finally watch all of these movies. I plan on doing a ranking video once that marathon is all done, so I'll keep my thoughts on the original Star Trek movie short, but this was not a good first impression. It's boring, tedious, and is basically an inferior imitation of 2001: A Space Odyssey with Star Trek characters in it. At least the next one is a lot better, I can say that much. Following that up, we have The Suicide Squad. Yes, The Suicide Squad is fun, but it didn't respond to this as strongly as other people did. Part of that has to do with me being averse to media that is edgy for the sake of being edgy. To compare to other superhero media, The Boys and Invincible were certainly full of harsh violence, but they also had emotional cores to counterbalance extremely graphic imagery. The inherent problem with The Suicide Squad, at least for me, is that it features characters who are clearly on skewered ends of the moral spectrum, but it can't really make its mind as to whether we're supposed to be rooting for their success or reeling in disgust from their morally depraved actions. Sometimes the result is hilarity, and other times I was just confused about what the movie was trying to say to me. It doesn't have quite the same level of tonal clarity that the Harley Quinn show on HBO Max does, which is probably the closest thing I can compare it to. The experience is enjoyable to an extent though. I'm sure it must have been cathartic for James Gunn to be taken in by Warner Brothers, as brain dead as that studio may be, and then be given complete freedom to express his bonkers ideas. For what it's worth, even though I wasn't enraptured by the plot or characters, the whole experience was put together skillfully. Everyone seemed like they were having fun and then put forth a great effort to make the film look professional, which was reflected by how legitimately entertaining it all was at times, depraved as it may have been. There's also a solid theme here about how America abuses its supply of prisoners for backhanded purposes, in addition to commentary on imperialism that others have written about more eloquently than I have. The rapturous praise people have heaped upon this movie seems a bit reactionary to me, but The Suicide Squad absolutely is worth checking out nonetheless. Next is The Great Muppet Caper. This is probably the Muppet movie I have least fondness for, but that's not entirely fair to the other Muppet movies I grew up with. It may take years to grow a stronger appreciation for the lovable silliness here, just like how images and jokes from movies like Muppet Treasure Island have been imprinted upon my memory. Maybe if the commercial from a VHS tape I religiously watched as a kid hadn't spoiled this movie's key moments, I'd have a stronger first impression. But there are also other movies in this series that were just stronger from a plot standpoint, whereas this one felt all over the place in a dissatisfying way. It spends a lot of time on individual gags and sequences, which leaves the main plot as just an underdeveloped through line for connecting those storylines together. At the end of the day though, it made for a nice evening spent with my mom who was recovering from surgery at the time. It was fun, and I will definitely watch it again sometime due to being a lifelong Muppet fan. In particular, Sam the Eagle was always my favorite Muppet, but this line of dialogue solidified that love even more.
You are all weirdos. Ugh.
And then the only TV show I watched in full this month was Season 1 of Star Wars The Bad Batch. I want to spare some of my full thoughts on Season 1 of this show for a video I have planned for either the end of September or the beginning of October, in which I want to talk about this as well as the upcoming Star Wars Visions. But to just give you a tease of my opinion, I enjoyed this, although it does leave much to be desired in various aspects. It isn't anywhere near as inconsistent or rough as Season 1 of the Clone Wars was, but neither does The Bad Batch have any episodes that really compare to the best of what that show had to offer, aside from maybe the pilot episode. If you're a fan of Star Wars on television though, I still think it's worth checking out, especially since it's one of the most cinematic animated TV shows you could find. And then I watched Candyman. I can't say I have any interest in seeing Candyman's spiritual sequel that released at the end of August, but just like when I watched Saw as Spiral released in May, I thought it would be the perfect opportunity to catch up with a genre classic. While it didn't leave a deep, lasting impact on me, Candyman is much more in its mind than other contemporary slashers. Here, there's a noticeable awareness of class conflict driving the film forward from a subtextual standpoint, while the camera's placement in each scene reflects the director's attention to spatial horror. The manner in which actors are blocked on the sets, as well as the excellent practical effects work, makes the surprisingly minimal amount of kills, on screen and off, all individually memorable. It's a horror film I admire more than I was personally affected by. But to be educated on film history is always a good thing, especially when said education provides me with a good time. Another horror movie classic I watched was Carrie. This movie was not quite as impactful as I hoped, but maybe that could be because I'm so used to many of the tropes this movie set as a precedent. It certainly was groundbreaking for its time and still works quite well, but otherwise feels dated due to it not feeling like a landmark that others followed like trend chasers, instead being on a similar level of quality to some of its worthy contemporaries. What everyone says about it being aggressively male-gazy and unnecessarily gratuitous with its sexual content is also true. That being said, Carrie is still a dang good time, bolstered by the fact that it never feels too serious. There's a slight level of camp present in the high school scenes that makes the main character's traumatic circumstances feel right at home with your average high school movie, which then makes the truly horrific stuff at home feel more powerful by comparison. There's enough of a contrast between these environments to set Carrie's development as a character as a forced inevitability. It's all capped off with Sissy Spacek's iconic performance, along with a colorful, pulpy, and shocking third act for the ages. All of you kids, and let's face it, adults too, better not be a bully. You never know when your subject of torment will turn out to be a vengeful telekinetic. And yet another horror movie I watched, albeit a new one, was The Night House. I found this to be one of the creepiest horror films I've seen in a while. I take issue with some of the jump scares earlier on in the first and second acts, the likes of which use obnoxiously unnecessarily loud noises, but I appreciate that it ultimately remained anchored in Rebecca Hall's amazing performance. Her and director David Bruckner gave us a character who clearly struggled deeply with the emotions she carries around from the inciting incident, and she felt like a genuine person going through something diabolical. The Night House goes into some valleys with its pace, but eventually works itself around to a finale that had me locked up in my reclining theater seat due to the tension. I haven't been that unsettled by a film's ending for a while, which was greatly helped by the atmospheric music, Bruckner's skillful choice of shots to cut to, and again, the performers. Some may not like how the last 5 to 10 minutes provide a rather stark clarity to the events of the plot, and while some of the tantalizing ambiguity gets lost in that, the reveals don't take away from the thematic power of what's presented in the story. In the end, it's yet another solid horror movie about grief in a post-Babadook world. Seek it out, I think it's worth your time. And now for something with a much more lighthearted mood, I watched the Simpsons Movie. Here's a formative movie from my youth. I got away with watching this series on too many late nights at a younger age than I care to admit, but that habit prepared me for a legendary movie-going experience with my dad at the fine age of 12 years old. 14 years later, and the Simpsons Movie is still hilarious. Call it a sick twist of irony that this film, along with the rest of the series, found its streaming home on Disney+, but it is a film that has aged quite well for better or worse. The messages left behind by this story still resonate with contemporary issues, yet I never felt like the subtext overpowered what is front and center here, which is the comedy and animation, for both are top-notch. Just like the SpongeBob movie before it, this film takes great advantage of the cinematic medium to give familiar settings and characters a much stronger visual flair, while the comedic writing is about on par with the show's golden era. It's just about as quotable as many of those classic episodes. Moreover, it actually gives each of the members of the Simpsons family their own arcs to resolve, even though Homer and Bart get more cohesive and satisfying resolutions than the rest. I appreciate that it's still quite entertaining to this day, and even though I have to keep my appreciation for the franchise quiet given that my wife hates The Simpsons, I plan to keep on watching it more over time. Another film I rewatched this month was John Wick. Here's another one that you probably have heard a thing or two about. This movie single-handedly revitalized Keanu Reeves' career, and for good reason. Not only did it give him the opportunity to show off his affinity for organic stunt work, but it complements his physical performance in a slick style formulated through careful shot structure and editing. In other words, it's one of the very few modern action films where you can actually see what the actors are doing. And it's great, despite the movie losing steam in the last 20 minutes or so. Aside from that, the context behind this particular viewing was that my parents will only watch R-rated movies if they're edited down to some degree. So that's what I did. I trimmed out some of the language and other content they might consider objectionable aside from the action scenes, and then we all watched it together at their cabin. I can't say that my mom was particularly thrilled, but my wife was already a fan, and my dad seemed to enjoy it well enough. We'll just wait and see if they feel inclined to watch the sequels too. And then a movie that my wife and I watched together was Charade. If you want some pure, old-fashioned fun, then look no further than this underappreciated gem. Given how many Hitchcockian tropes are all over this thing, Charade proved how to make them fresh and enjoyable, even for a movie produced all the way back in the early 1960s. Just make it goofy. While never crossing the line of silliness to become a Looney Tunes short, director Stanley Donen and company put together a story that balances seriousness enough to provide legitimate thrills, while infusing enough quirks here and there to keep the proceedings interesting. You'd sure be hard-pressed to find another movie with the sight of a dead man whose murder was caused by suffocation, juxtaposed with a scene of Cary Grant singing a song about hygiene products while taking a shower fully clothed. This is the kind of well-executed nonsense that made cinema from generations past so gleefully memorable. And if I've learned anything from this year, it's that one should not waste their time watching every new thing that comes out, for you'd have to sift through a lot of mediocrity in order to get to the truly good stuff. Instead of that, why not check out a film with an already established reputation that came out from years past? I'm glad my wife and I did in this case, for it was a lot of fun, and we quickly bought a copy of the Criterion Blu-ray soon thereafter. But then a movie that is even more fun than that is The Birdcage. Man, I sure underrated this the first time I saw it 5-ish years ago. I'm obviously no expert on how to properly depict the LGBT community on screen, but this simultaneously feels as though it squarely belongs in the 90s, while also having served as a majorly groundbreaking move forward in terms of representation. You just didn't get this kind of matter-of-fact depiction of queer people in mainstream cinema back then, making The Birdcage out to be a trailblazer. I'm sure it helped Nathan Lane feel more comfortable with his public persona, given how terrific his work is here. The same goes for the whole cast, of course, most especially Gene Hackman and the late and great Robin Williams, but Lane is the major standout in this awkward but highly effective situational farce. Hopefully I can get to the point where I can quote this as much as my in-laws do, because screenwriter Elaine May was on a roll with this hysterical script. And then the last movie I watched in August was Thelma and Louise. Does it glorify crime to an extent? Sure, you could argue that. Were there scenes that could have also been trimmed down? That's also debatable. But Thelma and Louise otherwise stands the test of time as a landmark example of depicting rape survivors on screen. It's simultaneously a joy to see these two women break free of the shackles that society used to hold them back, as well as a tragic shame as to why they were chained down in the first place. The film didn't have to bludgeon its audience with this feminist commentary scary either, for it all flows naturally from the dialogue Susan Sarandon and Gina Davis shared, while also emanating from the dynamic characters themselves. The story may be fun and exciting, but certain doom always seemed to be creeping up closer to Thelma and Louise, speaking to sad, unfair truths about the challenges women face even to this very day. But even without the subtext, Ridley Scott made a dang fun movie whose sights and sounds pulsated wonderfully on the big screen. A local theater chain in my area always plays a select classic film each Tuesday night, and had my wife not been at work, I can imagine she also would have gotten a kick out of it. Ultimately, I'm really hoping that this movie has the Sing Street effect on me, meaning that I really liked the film to begin with, but as time goes on, it becomes a personal favorite. And then the best new movie I watched this month was The Green Knight. If you put a fox in a movie, yeah, I'm gonna love it. But once you give me something as visually accomplished, ethereal, and mythical as this gorgeous interpretation of Arthurian lore, then that seals the deal. David Lowery is steadily becoming one of my favorite contemporary filmmakers due to his output in the 2010s. Ain't Them Body Saints and The Old Man and the Gun weren't quite as memorable to me, but his other films, Pete's Dragon, A Ghost Story, and now this movie, shows that he knows a thing or two about melding a story about the human spirit with some impeccable visuals. Slow pace and odd narrative choices aside, I want Hollywood to give me more fantasy movies like this. Ones who take a simple story, bolster it with characters challenged by their own insecurities, and infuse a style that efficiently makes every penny spent on the production visible to the viewer. There are plenty of movies out there who have budgets over 10 times the size of The Green Knight, and yet look cheaper than the result of a creative genius and his talented crew. It's a wonderful movie experience, and it's also a great one to watch around Christmas time if you want to watch something different than the typical classics. But then the absolute best movie I watched in August was Your Name. You're probably going to hear me talk about this movie a lot over time because it's one of my all-time favorite films. There are very few movies that have just hit me like a massive force pummeling my emotions into submission, but Your Name is one of those movies. It struck an enormous chord with me upon the first watch in a theater back in 2017, and while its screenplay is flawed, I find new things to love each time I watch it. On this particular occasion, I took a turn showing my buddies a movie that I personally love. My worry was that they wouldn't gain much compared to how I did, and while they probably didn't, I think our collective viewing experience was better than what I otherwise expected. They laughed quite often, became invested in the central narrative, and I gained a lot of pleasure seeing how they reacted to the many twists and turns present in this doozy of a story. My words can never fully do justice to how much of an impact Your Name has left with me, but it's been profound to say the least, and I'm glad that I could share it with dear friends of mine. And that's it for the month of August. You may have noticed that there were less new movies included in this ranking, and yeah, you could say I'm experiencing a minor burnout from how many new releases are getting shoved in our faces both on streaming platforms and in theaters. It's not only Marvel I'm experiencing fatigue with, it's pretty much everything. Because of that, I want to continue taking advantage of free time to catch up on classics that I've missed out on, but I will still make time for new releases that I'm genuinely interested in. Just don't expect me to set aside time to watch something like, I don't know, Clifford the Red Dog or something. Otherwise, if you liked this video and want to see more, please consider subscribing to the channel and join the notification squadron so that you don't miss out on my future videos. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a great one.